Item T is an evidence session with a panel of stakeholders on Screen Scotland, which is intended to provide an opportunity to discuss the performance of Screen Scotland in the context of the recommendations made by this committee in our report into Screen, which was published in June 2018. It doesn't seem that long ago, but it was. Can I welcome the witnesses to today's meeting? They are Eric Coulter, Director, Surefire Television Productions Limited, Bob Last, film producer, Barbara Orton, producer of True TV and Film, and Annabelle Page-Croft, producer and co-founder of Black Camel Pictures. Screen Scotland was launched during our inquiry in 2018, and it was intended to provide a step up in support for the industry in Scotland. Can I just open by asking you what your impression has been of Screen Scotland to date, and whether it is providing the kind of enhanced support that we all hoped would happen? Who would like to go first?
Thank you very much for having me, and nice to see some of you again. I definitely think there is a significant progress and a big step up in terms of when I last sat in front of you, and I think the Broadcast Content Fund is a great asset to Scotland at the moment. I also think it's fantastic to see some new leadership in Isabel Davis and David Smith. And appreciate that there's a lot of recruitment going on at the moment, and the sort of form that Screen Scotland is going to take is changing at the moment, and so it's quite hard to judge. But I think all the sounds, and what we're witnessing seem very positive. I would say as my opening gambit.
Well, I can go next then. Yeah, I would echo that. It's pretty fantastic having all the new funds and the new money, and it's opening up a lot of opportunities, and so that's really to be welcomed. And I would echo some of what Arabella said, but I am slightly concerned about the high growth potential emphasis, but we could talk about that a bit later. I'm concerned that there's a real emphasis on that and not on the rest of the developments in the sector, especially some of the smaller companies. But I can talk about that later, if you like.
Okay. Bob?
Going in line. I think it's certainly begun to bring a renewed focus on the sector. Obviously, it's coincided with a period of peak disruption of the sector. All of the old models are rapidly diminishing or going out the window. The new models are dominated by pan-global platforms. Nobody really knows how that's all going to shake out. A long time ago, I was in the music business when it went through a very similar disruption before film and television. Nobody got it right about what would happen. All sorts of business models disappeared. For example, now vinyl is selling more every week than it has done for decades. So it's very unpredictable, but it is a period of absolute peak disruption. Certainly all the models that I used to operate within no longer really work. So it is difficult for that reason to judge it, but it has certainly brought a focus, and certainly the new team have a real understanding and perspective. I think that the much play was made of it being a partnership, and I think therein some challenges remain to be resolved.
Hi, Eric Coulter. I suppose I'm slightly fraudulent in that at the moment I don't have really any interaction with Screen Scotland on a direct basis. I work for a lot of companies who do, in previous incarnations I did. From slightly standing back, I think the biggest issues are still how the balance between attracting inward investment and supporting Indigenous production, because I think everyone gets very excited about companies coming here and big things like that, and all that's fantastic. But I think the real long-term thing is support for Indigenous growth of Indigenous companies, and I think that still should be prioritised. In productions I've been involved in, I'm mainly a freelance producer. The companies that come here and receive money, whether it was from Creative Scotland or Screen Scotland, by and large were making shows. I work exclusively in television that were going to be shot here in any case. They didn't come here because of the money. they were coming here in any case. The money is helpful to them, but I don't think it would have made a difference to whether they come or not, and whether that money could be spent boosting local companies who need a bit of infrastructure and development support. I think that's one of the key questions.
In fairness, I think, you know, that tension between supporting Indigenous industry and attracting international productions was a tension that came out very much in our committee report as well. Can I just ask you, Eric, you say you haven't had much contact with, or any contact with Screen Scotland. Is that because you don't get any subsidy, or you don't look for grants?
Well, it's probably changing my business model. It says Director of Surefire Television, which is a company I set up about 10 years ago with another person. Basically, at the moment, I work more as a freelance producer, so I'm working for companies, and most of those companies have received funding from, whether it's Creative Scotland or Screen Scotland. I directly am not... I'm involved in it in some ways, but as my company, I haven't. I mean, 10 years ago, it was a different story. I was trying to find development money and seed money, etc., and I basically didn't get very far, to be honest. And I suppose a classic example of that is trying to develop drama. I work exclusively in drama. When you're starting up and you don't have any great funds behind you, and I went around all the usual, you know, Scottish Enterprise, at that point Creative Scotland, BBC Scotland, and to be honest, I got not a lot of support. But this is 10 years ago. About 10 years ago.
10 years ago,
yeah.
Right. Okay.
And I did at that point, but increasingly I've decided my business model is working on commission projects.
Right. Well, that kind of segues quite nicely into my next question, because one of the things that the creation of Screen Scotland was supposed to do was to create a one-stop shop so that people didn't have to go around all these different agencies. I know it's early days, you've said it's early days, but is your impression that a one-stop shop has been created?
Can I speak to that? Because I think it relates to the partnership issue. If the intent was to create a one-stop shop wherein the sector could tap into the resources of all the other partner organisations through one focus, I don't really see that happening. I think it is a one-stop shop in that it has the knowledge and ambition to interact across all matters with the sector, but I'm not sure it's really funneling other resources or expertise in. I think it's going the other way. My impression is that it is teaching the other partner organisations about the sector. Now, that might be a good thing, but I don't think that was the intended dynamic.
Anyone else?
I think I would just say it'll be interesting to see how, you know, when the business development person is put in charge and appointed at Screen Scotland, how that affects the producers. Because at the moment we have a programme called Focus, which is lending some business support. And that is, you know, I don't know, there's still this, you know, we still don't quite understand, you know, what's happening at Scottish Enterprise and what's happening at Screen Scotland in terms of business support going forward. And you would echo, you know, what Eric is saying in terms of how do we help nurture, support the businesses of Indigenous producers as still, you know, crying out for sort of priority attention. And I think that tension between Scottish Enterprise and Screen Scotland probably still remains.
What I'd say about the one-stop shop is that it seems to have been interpreted as a website which gives information as a one-stop shop, and it certainly falls short of the recommendations that were made in that June report for it was produced in 2018, because what the call in that report, which was reflected in the recommendations, was for all sorts of different kinds of support. There was for training schemes, for mentoring support, for professional courses, for all sorts of things that would go across the whole of the industry, from high-end companies through to small production companies, through to facility companies, through to craft skills development. And, you know, it would be great to see that, and I would echo what's been said here about the partnership. It's great that the agency have come together. You know, it is an interagency organisation now, Screen Scotland. It's great that they're talking together, but the danger of that is that the talking goes on, and as it goes on, the agencies just revert back to their original remits, and I think we can see a bit of that happening.
Any examples of that?
Well, yeah, for example, it seems that as part of the vision for development, Creative Scotland, Screen Scotland, have employed a high growth strategy for development, which is a Scottish enterprise strategy. That they've adopted that, and it seems that a lot of things are going down that route. And while it's welcome for some companies, it doesn't suit all of the companies on the broad spectrum of companies in the production sector. And so, you know, I think people are looking for the kind of support, for additional support for the Indigenous companies. I mean, it echoes that again.
And I think we would just, you know, seek more clarity on that, wouldn't we? You know, what is the difference between the high growth strategy at Scottish Enterprise and the high growth strategy at Screen Scotland? You know, that might be a question worth digging into, just so we all understand that going forward.
Bob?
I also co-chair the Scottish Government's Creative Industries Advisory Group, and it's interesting that you raised the issue of high growth, and it's emerged immediately in these questions. You know, a high growth strategy relates to an economic insight from the 1950s. And we still, in Scotland, spend a lot of time talking about it. I have no idea why. It's no longer the 1950s. And across all of the creative industries, we've spent a huge amount of time, and I have to say that there is a lot of evidence within the Scottish Government of a real understanding and sympathy to the fact that micro businesses and nano businesses across the entire sector, not just film and television, are the drivers of economic sustainability and ultimately growth. And it seems to be a continuingly unresolved tension. And I hate to sort of individualize specific agencies, but the bottom line is Scottish Enterprise have obsessively maintained a commitment to this 1950s economic perception. And it gets in the way of effective intervention. And I think that, but I do think, on a positive note, that Screen Scotland now have the gravitas and the expertise and the resources to hopefully educate their partners.
Very interesting. I'm sure other members want to pick up on some of those points. I'll now pass over to Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. As part of the report that this committee issued just almost 2 years ago, we recognised the need for a film studio and for increased infrastructure and opportunities within Scotland. That was following on from an Enterprise Committee report that was a few years before. We then took evidence from Screen Scotland almost 2 years ago, who told us they were limited in what they could say because of commercial sensitivities, but there's this option of facilities down in Leith. So far, we've had no studio announcement, so we still don't have any significant studio space in Scotland. What is the panel's understanding of where progress is on that issue, and what is the impact on Scotland of not having the kind of facilities we are seeing in Liverpool, in Leeds, obviously expansion in London, Northern Ireland, other comparable cities and countries?
I think I'm almost working in this business almost 40 years, and one of the first things I did was look for build space for studios, and I'm still doing it 40 years later on productions, and it's just dreary and boring. I think we get confused about what we need. I mean, I think we go to those cities like Manchester or Bristol or whatever. The studios, I say I work exclusively in television really, are very simple. They're not huge, and I think we get wrapped up again. It seems I'm not an expert in this, on these big, ideas of studios, and we want to attract Star Wars and stuff like that. That's not really the issue. Is people, again, I think, are never going to come to Scotland just for studio. It's not going to be like people going shoot in South Africa because the studios are there and they're cheap, or they're going to shoot in Eastern Europe. I don't think we're in that business, because I don't think we can compete. So people are going to come here to shoot because they want to come to Scotland, and then the lack of studio becomes an issue, like going back to Braveheart or whatever, where they go and shoot an island, or Game of Thrones, etc. So I think not having a proper studio is obviously an obstacle. I think it can be quite it doesn't have to be an elaborate thing. Film studios are not elaborate; they're 4 walls, soundproof. That's what it is. And I think others may disagree that, in actual fact, I think any studio, and I know there's been all sorts of different, projects mooted, should either be on the west side of Edinburgh or the east side of Glasgow. I think that M8 corridor. I think Leith, personally, having just been involved in a production, quite a big television production, where we're looking for studio space based in Glasgow, we didn't even look at Leith because we wouldn't get the crew. So, I mean, I know Leith is where the effort's been put into, so I'm sorry to put sort of pour water on that, but I think that will become an issue. I mean, over the years I've worked, again, if we're shooting in Edinburgh quite often, and for instance, I was the producer on the series of Rebus with Ken Stott. We shot majority of that in Glasgow, and then we came to Edinburgh for some days, and that's a purely economic decision. So therefore, I think that M8 corridor, or central Scotland, is where we should be looking to.
How long can crew travel before we're paying overnights?
About an hour. I mean, Edinburgh to Glasgow. I mean, unfortunately, for people who live in Edinburgh, everyone expects them to come to Glasgow and won't pay them. The other way round. I mean, the reason we didn't shoot Rebus fully in Edinburgh was because we couldn't afford the overnights. And so if you build a studio, you want to have crew sleeping in their own bed. And again, a studio that's relying on really specialist skills. Outlander's made a huge difference to that, but we don't really have those specialist skills. So those big studio films, the Mission Impossibles, the Star Wars, all those kind of things, we're not in that league at all and won't be for a long time. I think we could be, but as a starting point in studio space, it needs to be something. The Space Project in Manchester, which I've used, has got 3 studios of, I think, 12,000 feet. It's a converted industrial unit, and there's television productions and film productions in and out there all the time.
And how do other panel members feel about the proposals around, well, what's your understanding of the progress that's been made, and what kind of studio do you think Scotland needs?
I'm still not quite sure where we are in the progress, but I mean, what I've sort of picked up from crew is that people are really concerned about the travel time between Glasgow and Edinburgh into Leith, because it's the wrong side of Edinburgh for the majority of crew who are Glasgow based, and that additional sort of 40 minutes or whatever it is to get onto the motorway back to Glasgow is going to impact crew decisions to work over in the East Coast. I think, Bob, you are probably more up to speed with where it is at the moment, but I think, everybody's still waiting for decisions. I mean, I would, echo everything Eric is saying, but I also would strongly say, I think, we need to be in it to compete, and I don't think we should be thinking too small, and I think, we are in this, disruptive golden age of television, and we just can't be missing out on these millions and millions of pounds worth of production. And I think, we need to get on with it. Again, we are still having these conversations several years later. Why?
I believe that Screen Scotland are appearing in front of the committee next week. Given all the promises that have been made for a long time, it would seem fairly surprising if they weren't appearing to give you some clear news. I think that I take Eric's point. I think the notion that a studio in Scotland is a one-stop solution to a really complicated ecosystem of production is a kind of false thinking. It is a very disruptive time in the market. These huge international peripatetic productions go to different places for all sorts of reasons. They have different needs. It's never been the case of any of the more ambitious studio propositions that I've seen that they would also serve the smaller productions. I've looked over time. The studio saga has gone on for decades in here, and I've often thought as a producer, great, if they want to build a big studio, lovely. I'm still going to go and find a very cheap shed for my lower budget production. So the studio doesn't solve everything, and if there is a studio of scale, then it does bring with it lots of other infrastructural challenges that have to be risen to. And one certainly would be the crew base. And that, I think, though, I'm a lifelong resident of Edinburgh, so of course I have a different perspective on this notion of a Glasgow crew base, but we need to have a central belt crew base to service big productions, and that will take a long time to develop. And so if there is increasing infrastructure, the crew issue will have to be resolved over time. But when Outlander, the other thing is we do have studios. We have Ward Park. Thankfully, it's busy. We can't say that's a problem that it's busy. It's great that it's busy, and it has had to drive a considerable increase in the skill set and the crew base, so it can be done.
Barbara, do you have any?
Well, it could. I would just add quickly. My side's documentary, really, so I'm not so involved. I've just got anecdotal information about the studio, but talking to crew and people who are based in who are working on Outlander, they always say, well, we could be busier. You know, there could be more Outlanders in that specific place.
Yeah, I think we choose not. I think my understanding again is that Sonny spent a lot of money in that place, but they don't own it. The original person owns it, and he won't do anything that will impinge on Outlander. So that's a choice to not. But they can afford to have the space.
Yeah.
And
But we need lots of different spaces. In other words, that's what we're.
Yeah, and what do you think? I mean, we rehearsed all this before when we did the report, but do you think? What do you think the barriers are? Why in Scotland have we not developed a studio space, whether it's to increase capacity for big productions or if it's to provide facilities for smaller productions? And we do have the Ward Park studio, which Sony came in and put huge investment in over recent years. It's exclusively for Outlander. So there's still the question mark around what happens to that once Outlander's finished. But it's taken a private investor to come in and do that. So why aren't we getting more private investors, or what are the problems for the government getting involved? Obviously, state aid was brought up, but we know that Manchester took a different approach and was able to build a facility that was supported by the public sector. What do you think why is this not happening?
personally, it's obviously because how do you make money out of it? If it's a private thing, you know, studios, we don't want to pay. I'm used to going into old sheds like Bob. We don't want to. We're used to not paying a lot of money. So all of a sudden, someone provides a studio, but it's 5 times what it costs you to get an old shed. So I think it seems to me it's obviously the reason it hasn't happened is because any private investors looked at it and wondered if they can actually make money out of it. You know, if it's only going to be occupied 35 weeks a year, etc., etc. So there needs to be some form of support there.
It's important to distinguish between the wider economic impact of, for example, Outlander, or if some other big production came in, and the actual business model of a studio. Because as Eric pointed out earlier, a studio is actually a very simple thing. Along with it being a very simple thing, a studio margin is a tight margin. You know, it is an economic proposition in itself, is quite tight. It can create a massive amount of other economic activity or facilitate it, but that money doesn't go to operating a studio. So I think that's the answer to your question. But you know, there are also other spaces. Film City have spaces. There are other people looking at smaller scale spaces. It's not that there's absolutely nowhere to shoot.
Thank you.
Did you want to come in, Rod?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, just to follow up this point, and it follows on nicely from what Eric and Bob have just said. Point's been made to us before about the difference between converted and purpose-built studio space by the likes of AFTPS. I'm wondering, is this approach, particularly at Leith, the effort to convert a space into something substantial, does that match with the priority of getting these large productions and large production companies in that's in Screen Scotland's strategy? So you mentioned, you know, you're used to filming in, as long as it's a soundproof shed for those smaller productions and lower budget productions. Yeah.
They're never soundproof.
Yeah.
You have to stop because it rains.
I mean, the problem also is, like, for instance, I looked, a few years ago, I was looking for a studio space, and I looked at the old black and white building out in the outskirts of Glasgow, which would have been fantastic, I think, as a permanent studio. I had like 4 spaces, ceiling height, and all those things. There was no way for a production that needed a space for 3-4 months I could afford to spend money on that. Mm-hmm. And that's so you end up going in buildings that are inappropriate. And also, I mean, not so much now, but in the past, dangerous, I think, and not good. I mean, a big thing about health and safety and working hours and all this is a big issue. And so you end up working quite a lot of environments that are not ideal.
So is this an issue that purpose-built space is not being pursued? That so far the developments towards the studio driven by Screen Scotland have been about the conversion of space, particularly at Leith, rather than purpose-built studios like what we're seeing in Manchester, Liverpool, Bristol, etc.
A lot of the ones in Manchester are also conversions. I mean, I don't know the economics of a new build as opposed to a conversion, but it's interesting. Most of the spaces start from as my understanding, start from a building. I think there is some purpose-built. But yeah, I mean, if money was not an object, I think you would build a purpose-built studio at Harthill it would be, you know, with the 6 stages of different sizes, all that kind of stuff. But obviously that takes a lot of money.
It comes back down to, as Eric pointed out, it's the economics of running a studio. And it's a tight margin business, and capital. What you're talking about is a substantial increase in the capital investment to achieve the facility. So I think one would assume that's why over time, and you know, talking about what Screen Scotland doing, this debate about studios in Scotland has not changed very much for the last 15 years. And
I read an article from 1935 for the need for a studio in Scotland.
But the answer to your question is it's a simple business thing. The capital cost of a new build from scratch is higher. And therefore the economic model of operating it is more problematic.
Do you want to go on with the rest of your questions?
Yeah, if that would be convenient.
might as well.
Yeah. So, sorry, excuse me. Going on to this wider issue of Screen Scotland strategy and focus on companies of scale, do you think, as a whole, looking at Screen Scotland's business plan and your impression of their strategic vision so far, are they getting the balance right between attracting large-scale international production and support for the Indigenous sector?
Talk about support for the Indigenous sector. To me, I think it goes back to a kind of, you know, asking the right question. At the minute, if you, for example, if you ask a question, how do we develop 3 companies to be over, to have 10 million turnover or whatever it is over a space of time, and a further 20 or 40 companies to develop them. If you ask that kind of question, you get one sort of strategy, which is about business development and growth. If you ask another question, which is how do we, as a screen agency, create the opportunities for more films of quality to be developed in Scotland, you get a completely different strategy, and it's a sort of strategy that points towards co-production. It points towards international co-production, and you know, and the sort of scheme, and this is what was kind of called for in that document with the recommendations. It was, you know, we wanted a sector that would support international co-production with training schemes, with specifically with mentoring schemes, with relationship building, with partnership building, and there was a lot of suggestions on the detail of that, and that's what I think is being looked for, because if the perceived weakness of the sector is a lack of good quality market ready projects, what are Screen Scotland doing to remedy that situation? And then what are they doing? You know, it's a question. And then what are they doing to, once, if there is market-ready projects, schemes and initiatives to develop these projects, what is being done to broker these schemes into the international marketplace or the domestic marketplace or any marketplace? You know, what's being done? And what I would like to talk about really is that, you know, there are schemes that have been done. The European Union, through its media programme in Creative Europe, have pioneered the kind of training schemes that result in a developed cultural sector, socially developed, economically developed, and result in a diverse film culture in Europe. There are these schemes. But, and what the kind of training that they've pioneered, it's called training, but it's really about opportunity to market, are these integrated programs that are project-based, that take producers, whatever, it doesn't matter what size of company it is, it's about, they take producers and production teams and quality projects. It's competitive. The projects have got to be quality, and the quality is measured by, will they be have they got distribution potential? You know, it's not, you know, whether the company grows big or not, but that's the thing. And so, and the kind of training, it's probably worth detailing a bit, because it's kind of what it looks like is really important. They're project based. They develop the storytelling side of it. They develop written proposals and treatments, pitches, trailers. They develop projects with the production teams to get market-ready projects of quality. And then built into these training schemes, there is an opportunity, which are sort of 3-week blocks over a year or 18 months. There are opportunities once these projects are developed, which also include business support schemes like, you know, how to make financial plans, how to make deals in an ever-changing market, you know, with the new streamers coming on, what these deal packages are like, how you put these deals together. Then coupled with opportunities to pitch these projects at market, so the brokerage mechanism is built into the training programme. So the whole point about it is an integrated scheme that any producer of any size can get onto as long as they've got an initially potentially quality project that's got international distribution potential. And, you know, what my worry is at the minute is that the media desk that is based in Screen Scotland is, you know, it's fantastic that we've got a media desk based there that can broker producers and teams from Scotland into these schemes. But with Brexit, that is all going to end. You know, 2 days ago, the British government announced that they weren't going to negotiate participation in the Creative Europe programme. So, you know, so what have we got left in Scotland? And I think it's an urgent question now that we need these kind of training schemes, which is a different strategy. It's an international strategy. It's a co-production strategy, but it can apply across the board and indigenous companies particularly can benefit from that, which is especially, I just think it's crucial now, especially with the streamers, you know, the new streamers coming on market. And, you know, apparently we haven't got quality projects, enough quality projects to be brokered into, you know, meeting the Netflix and the Amazons and all of these people as producers. And
post-Brexit strategy is definitely something that we'll be asking Screen Scotland about next week. When they're
because, sorry, I'll just say this last thing, because, you know, in Scotland at the minute, we have not got an integrated scheme. We've got lots of different bits of schemes, lots of different, you know, like the Focus is a business scheme, there's skills development schemes, there's professional development schemes. Some of the skills development schemes are really fantastic that some of the training agencies are doing, but they're not joined up. They're all bits and pieces all over the place, and that's not what was called for in your report. I think you're well aware of all of this, and that would be good. So we need that kind of scheme, I think, in Scotland, that is run by independent agencies and not production company-led agencies that we've had, that the situation that's been allowed to develop where production companies have been doing quite a lot of new talent training, which is a real conflict. It's become a real issue as a conflict of interest within the production sector and, you know, unfair competition, basically. And it's crucial that indigenous companies are not only have opportunities to develop these projects, but to get brokered into a marketplace.
Can I just speak to, I mean, I certainly recognise what you're talking about, Barbara, and that need, and there's no doubt that outside of the EU, it needs to be looked at. To do it properly, it's very resource intensive. So, you know, one has to recognise that. But I think this relates back to some of the things of the genesis of Screen Scotland, and it relates back to the whole issue of high growth rhetoric and large-scale companies. Of course, developing some large-scale companies would be great. However, in this moment of peak disruption, really what those would look like, you've got to be a little careful because they wouldn't look like what we thought they would be five or 10 years ago. But I think it is worth examining the measures of success that were embedded in the creation of Screen Scotland, and I think they are problematic. I said so to many parties at the time. I think they're entirely unhelpful and unreasonable and based on flaky numbers in the first place. So you've got unhelpful KPIs for the organisation based on very dubious starting points numerically.
That's really useful. Could you give some examples of that? Because that's exactly the kind of thing that we can be raising next week.
I didn't come prepared to quote chapter and verse on that, but yeah. In essence, they have been put in a position where to deliver on their remit, bringing in big high-end productions is the only way they'll hit the numbers. And that's a great thing. It's great for Scotland. And if it's sustained in the long term, it will be great for the whole ecosystem in industry. So it's not to be negative about that at all. I do think it's very important, and I do think we're missing out on it as a country, you know, and everybody else is in there. But you need to give them the KPIs that allow them also to focus on the sort of thing Barbara's talking about. And it is tied back into this same 1950s rhetoric, which is embedded, and I would urge people to look at reviewing that part of the organisation's remit.
So just to briefly follow that up, are you saying that the kind of KPIs they've got around attracting international production in are essentially too narrow around the kind of immediate economic return of that, rather than a broader benefit to the indigenous sector?
No, that's not exactly what I'm saying, because the KPIs do not specifically relate to international productions. They've just got numbers they're supposed to hit in return for getting the additional resources.
Right.
And that's just stupid. I mean, it has nothing to do with effectively measuring the value of the sector to the country. It was the wrong approach. Of course, there are some narrow things where one can use numbers, and I'm not opposed to metrics, but these numbers are arbitrary. The baselines are meaningless, and the way they're embedded make it more difficult for the organisation to focus on some particular areas of its remit.
But I can add a point to that, actually, you know, as part of an international strategy. If, you know, we welcome some of this inward investment because, you know, great, and on all sorts of levels, but if there was with a robust set of terms and conditions that actively make partnerships with the production, the industry in Scotland, right from crew and hiring local crew, through to facility companies, through to production partnerships. If there was a robust set of conditions as part of that, everybody would benefit. It's a win-win for everyone. You know, the incoming companies benefit from the finance, of course. The Scottish screen benefits from the promotional opportunities. You know, here we are in this big headline making film. And also in the indigenous companies would benefit too, because it would be skills development, it would be on-the-job work training, it would be a whole range of benefits. And, you know, I would like to see that as part of the vision that Screen Scotland are continuing to develop, you know, which is more than just a business development vision. I would like to see a wider vision that would include an international strategy that would address inward investment and indigenous companies.
That was really useful, thank you.
Thank you. Stuart?
Thank you. Just a few questions, but first of all, the issue of the one-stop shop, which touched upon earlier on, is there still a feeling that when an organisation contacts Screen Scotland, potentially they're then redirected to go into maybe another agency, particularly Scottish Enterprise? Was that the message coming from yourselves earlier?
Say probably not. I think if you're an incoming company or an inward producer, you will be directed to the right place. I think we were sort of talking about more as Indigenous producers working here today.
Okay.
I think also possibly the problem arises more around the business support. You know, if you're trying to access support or information about on a project basis, I think it's pretty clear. But where it becomes more complex is around business support in the way that Barbara was talking about. And obviously that business support was a key part of the intent of Screen Scotland, as I understand it, you know, following on from this committee's report, amongst other things, that it should start delivering a joined up approach. And it's in that kind of area where I think it's difficult for me to speak directly to what it's really like if you're just coming cold. I don't know.
I mean, they're two different things, aren't they? There's coming looking for a co-producer and trying to find money. There's a big difference between, projects and business. And that's always what we're wrestling with as Indigenous producers, because you're looking for money for your projects to develop them, and you're trying to keep your business alive while you get your projects made, where you may earn a fee. If you're in TV, you may earn bigger fees. I think that is the challenge. I think one of the things I'm interested in, and I think is sort of apropos of a lot of this, is actually really asking Screen Scotland to drill down on data in terms of what Indigenous producers are working with the BBC, are working with Channel 4, are working with the BFI. I mean, I feel personally that our producers are being really left behind in terms of we're not making enough projects or developing enough with these other agencies and broadcasters. And I think that is the sort of thing that has the potential to be really transformative in terms of our Indigenous companies. So I would really kind of ask that in terms of just understanding what we are converting as producers with those other partners, and if the MOUs are going to be effective. And also, looking at things like diversity, how many female director projects have they supported in the last decade? These are the numbers that we need to look at in terms of going forward, and then maybe giving some strategic goals in terms of of numbers of what we're trying to hit. That would be, I think, would be great for us to see. I mean, don't want to go off tangent, but going back to the brokerage and the marketing, one of the things I feel that we are really missing at the moment is Market Leaders, which has been stopped. And Market Leaders really wasn't perfect, but it was a great programme in terms of us as producers having a broker to help us get access to people. So we would be able to say, can you help us get access to Netflix? It's hard getting into these huge organisations, or how do I get to that person in BBC Films? And just having, when you're an Indigenous producer, just having more brains in terms of access, whether it's to Amazon or whoever it is, or getting to LA or getting to the agencies, the CAAs and the WMEs, that is a really important resource. And that's gone. And as far as I know, nothing has replaced it yet. And also, sorry, that just leads me to one more thing is, so every time we go to a market now, we don't have that third party helping us set up the meetings. So that I think is something we need to do. And every time we now go to a market, Berlin, Cannes, MIPCOM, documentary markets, we have to then apply for grant funding. So as experienced producers, you're having to do applications every 5 minutes to get 1,500 quid. When you've made the amount of work that we've all made, it's like we're kind of being micromanaged to have to do huge amounts of paperwork to try and get small amounts of money out. And it'd be nice to just say, look, these are experienced producers, give them an allocation for markets, or which Market Leaders did. They said, do you want to come to Berlin? What are your projects? What are you pitching? Okay, you're in and you've got support. That was very helpful. So, I mean, those are just two observations I think that I feel would like to acknowledge.
Yeah, I would echo that as well, that role cannot be underestimated, but it needs to be an independent agency that are doing the brokerage, not production company-led delegations or production company-led pitches or production company-led training initiatives. It's all right having some of that, but if that's the only funnel that there is for access, it's an unhealthy situation. And yourselves, the call in that report was for, perhaps for Screen Scotland, the Screen unit at that time, to adopt a kind of an employment strategy that would bring in producers into the team, for 3 or 4 years, along the lines of the Danish model. I don't have to go into it again today because you've heard it a million times, I'm sure. That the entrepreneurial type producers that could fulfill these brokerage roles within Screen Scotland. And that's been the call in that report, and subsequently that's been said over and over and over and over again. But within the staffing structures that we're looking at that seem to be developed, I can't see that, or it might not have been articulated yet, but I can't see what the new positions, how the new positions are going to take on that role that the industry has called for.
Well,
many times.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we'll see. I mean, we would just ask that those people who are being employed are, you know, come from the industry. If that's what's going to make a big difference to us, people who speak our language, aren't bureaucrats, and have experience of being in the field, as it were.
But are they going to be employed full-time? That wasn't the model that was suggested. The model suggested was to come in for 3 or 4 years from the industry to suspend all the production projects while they're in the agency, as it happens in Denmark, and then go back into the industry again, you know, with more skills, more contacts, more expertise and knowledge and everything, all the benefits that accrues to the sector. And that's been a really, although I'm not saying that Denmark is perfect, that has been a good strategy in terms of development there.
Okay.
I'd like to go into the issue of the infrastructure. Notwithstanding the Leith discussion that was highlighted earlier on and has also been discussed quite a great deal over the period of time, has there been much dialogue between Screen Scotland and the sector regarding further studio space?
It's a studio working group. I'm not on it. It's not my remit.
I mean, again, I think although it's slightly broadened out, I mean, I think we do get fixated on the studio. And I think one of the, not particularly Screen Scotland, one of the biggest barriers to the growth of Indigenous production, and I work almost exclusively in television drama, is lack of commissioning power here, which is, you know, the whole thing about follow the money. You know, why are there a lot of film companies in Los Angeles? Because that's where the studios are. Why is there a lot of production companies in London? Because that's where it is. So I've worked in the past 10 years, mainly in Scotland, on productions that have gone through BBC Scotland. None of those companies are Scottish companies. It's all Scottish content, and the money comes through the BBC's internal workings. But so there is no, in drama certainly, there is virtually no commissioning power in Scotland, as in the rest of the UK. It's very centralised. And I think in terms of how do companies grow, then that is an issue. I think
that's a very important point. I think the notion of infrastructure in the conventional sense matters, but so does soft infrastructure, which is in a way what Eric is talking about. And there needs to be an equal focus on soft infrastructure, not least because hard infrastructure doesn't work if it's not also embedded in the right soft infrastructure. But soft infrastructure is the infrastructure that helps generate helps smaller businesses sustain and grow. And that's where the I mean, my understanding is, but I think there is a real determination to try and focus on that. But I would come back to the government has to take responsibility for the KPIs it's given the organisation, but I think the organisation has the capability and certainly speaks about wanting to help develop that soft infrastructure. I personally. I don't know in detail about the MOU with the BBC. I am slightly dubious about the effectiveness of these MOUs. The BBC's had a long track record of not really honouring its commitments to spend locally, as Eric has just highlighted, and I don't know if the MOU is going to...
There is a local spending example I was talking about earlier. For instance, Monaco the Glen, which, you know, ran for years and was very good for Scotland and employed lots of crew and did all those things 7 or 8 years. When that finishes, that production company goes back to London. There's no intellectual property left in Scotland. There's no legacy in terms of development fund, etc. If that had been an Indigenous company, then all of a sudden that company's got a base of 7 years of production or whatever it was. That will fund its development, that will fund its overhead, all of those things which returning series do. And so if we could have 2 or 3 companies, and I'm going like that, like for instance, if you go to Manchester Red Productions, which has now been bought over, but very big company there, had made such a difference to that economy because it had returning shows and it was able to grow. And I think that's kind of what we need. So a lot of spend in Scotland when it's on productions is great because it employs a lot of people and economically it's great, but there is no the legacy of it. I think.
That is, I mean, actually going back to your very early point about not being able to find money for development, you know, when you were out looking, you know, when you go to the market as a producer, I mean, I've been working with all 3 for the last couple of years and who are a distribution company and saying to them, look, I need to be in drama development, I need more investment. And they've said, as soon as you convert your first 6-part drama into production, we will invest in you. And I've said, no, you're missing the point. Because if I don't have investment now, I can't get my first 6-part drama to production. So I think that is the sort of chicken and egg that producers have. You've got to take so much risk to get to be out there and be developing. And that is really worth the risk of investing in development, I think, on producers. Because it's really hard in the market to get that point. I mean, I know if Claire Mandel was sitting here with, The Cry, she would be saying how long it took her to get her first project, across the line and into broadcast. So that's just one thing. And the other thing I would say on the MOU is, there has been a collaboration between BBC Scotland and Screen Scotland on some sort of digital content and some programming that is coming through, but the budgets are just not sustainable. I mean, I've just produced 2 15-minute dramas for 20,000 each. I mean, I'm barely paying, I'm not even really paying living wages. And I think we have to hold accountable our screen agency and the BBC in terms of the productions that are being made and go, are your producers paying living wages? Because it's really, we're all desperate to get opportunities to make drama in Scotland. But I'm being asked to produce, and we're good producers, and you're just kind of going, how do we make this series happen? So then I'm going out with a very small amount of money to the market going, well, the BBC and Screen Scotland are on, but I need to go and get more money. But they're saying, the BBC is saying, well, we want all these rights. I mean, I haven't got any negotiating traction as well. So, I mean, that is an issue that's arising for so many producers in Scotland at the moment is we've got this new channel, but there's no money. And producers, I mean, I've just done a big deal with Sky on another series that Bob and I are working on together. And that's a £4 million deal. But my deal with BBC Scotland at the moment is 100,000. So you're like, oh, the producer's having to go elsewhere. The money's not here.
Has the committee spoken to Ewan Angus since he left the BBC?
But certainly, given
I think
us,
you would find that an interesting conversation.
Yeah. And we're going to have to bring in some other members, I'm afraid. Annabelle.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, panel. Very interesting discussion thus far. Turning to the issue of the skills strategy, I mean, can I just clarify? So Creative Scotland has said that a draft was to be complete by the end of 2019 on the skills strategy. Has that happened? Is that, as far as you're aware? Obviously, we can check with them, but...
Check with them. I mean, I'm not entirely
check
sure
with,
where we are with skills at the moment.
There's there's an overall training strategy that hasn't been published yet, that has been delivered.
Okay. Well, I think there was
a consultant, I think.
Yeah.
I think the collective absence of a good answer is, in fact,
the answer.
the answer.
Well, obviously we will pursue that. It's just that had been the intention, whether it's the reality or not. But in terms of their work at whatever stage it is on this new skills strategy, I mean, what would you like to see the focus on? New entrants, or what would you like to see the focus on?
Well,
I've talked about that a little bit, and I would like to see some sort of integrated training, not just skills development, although that's needed. Mm-hmm. That's not, the professional course and all this kind of thing, but it's not. It's not just that there has been an emphasis on new talent, people who want to get in. But just to quote a skill set executive that I heard the other day, it's not training and development. It's not just about people to get in. It's about people who want to get on. And within many mature producers in this sector, there's still training needs. The market is changing all the time. But training is, in the broadest sense, that is about opportunities to make relationships, to make partnerships, to develop projects. It's that kind of overall
But it's also
emphasis.
about accountability, isn't it? Because if, for example, you say, right, how many new directors have made first films this year? This is what I mean. We've got to drill down on the data, and we've got to look at, where are the skills paying off? So, how many female directors have made their first feature film in the last 5 years? you know, this is how we're going to kind of look at where skills are developing. You know, I mean, everybody is aware of this. There is a really big problem with getting first films made because, you know, financing first-time filmmakers and second-time filmmakers is really difficult. And I think, you know, it'd be interesting to take a lead from Irish Screen, who have now got a programme to fully finance first films for female directors. And I think, you know, these are the sort of groundbreaking, you know, initiatives, innovative schemes that we should be, you know, looking at, or kind of going, okay, how do we do this and how do we make it better? What's our interpretation of this scheme? So that I would just look for kind of, you know, again, accountability and outcomes in terms of what the skills are trying to achieve.
Sorry?
There tends to be an absence in training planning around actual new cohorts of producers. It's often left off. You know, a producer's fundamental job is to connect creativity and money in an effective manner. It's not a simple thing to do, and it requires you to be across quite a complex array of issues and factors, and it is often, there's a shortage of training of that. And arguably, if there was a bit more focus on training of producers, if you had a good new cohort of producers, that will naturally help a sort of multiplier effect, because it is producers who have to bring these things together and enable productions to happen. And I think also around producers, an issue there that's always been of interest to me is that there was some recent data, and I'm not quite sure where it came from, where I think, in essence, the British producer pool is largely privately wealthy. Now, I'm thoroughly middle class. I am not privately wealthy. I've always had to work for my living. And I think producer training, again, is in terms of diversity and in terms of economic diversity, it's really, really important. Because at the moment, the only way you get any experience as a producer is either by putting your house on the market or by being privately wealthy. It's extremely difficult. So I would advocate. Yeah, I would just advocate that isn't left off the training agenda.
Absolutely, and I think recognising that, you know, I mean, there was a report, wasn't there, recently that was published in the trade saying, you know, the average wage of a producer is £6,000 and per annum. And, you know, I was talking to a young producer recently, and she was talking about the film that she's about to make. And I said, what's your salary? I said, what's your fee on that? And she said, 20,000. And I said, well, you know, you're going to lose half of that closing and you're not going to be able to live. And so we are developing this, you know, we are, you know, looking to develop new producers, but we have to really help. And I think the agency, you know, must help the new producers. We've got to protect the producers' line and empower the producers in closing. And if that means releasing some money to help them get their first films made, but let's make sure there's some overhead and some wages going to those producers, because they're the ones out there taking the risk. They're the ones developing the talent. They're the people out in market representing all of us and representing Scotland.
Have any of you been asked to give your thoughts to this working group on the skills strategy?
Producers on that. I don't know who the producer is, but we can find out.
None of you here, just to clarify, have been involved in
Not on it,
this.
no.
In terms of looking at sort of downstream issues, potentially, you know, if they came forward with a suggestion that possible funding conditions should relate to skills training opportunities or such like, would that be something you would support or not?
If there was
So,
more...
in terms of any funding that they may award, should there be any conditions attached to that funding in terms of promotion of skills training opportunities or whatever?
As part of an word investment strategy, you mean?
Well,
No,
as part of their funding grant. I mean, if they award funds, they've got some opportunity to say, to an extent, what they would like to see. And one of the things they could argue, I suppose, is for greater skills focus.
Sorry, that would be helpful. But the biggest issue when you go project by project is training. You know, like for instance, Outlander can do a great training programme, I believe, because they're a returning show that comes back every year. They're basically 12 month a year operation. There's very, very few productions like that. So putting the onus onto the production companies projects to do training is really dodgy, I think, because it's very, very difficult. You know, if you're setting up a project, you get 2 or 3 months, you know, from you get the green light to doing it. The last thing on your mind, to be honest, is training. and you get people in place. So there has to be a strategy for it, but I think it has to be led, whether it's by Screen Scotland or BBC or the broadcaster, with a wider set, because putting the onus on productions, I think, is not the best way forward.
That's a little different in animation. In that, I'm involved in animation, and again, you are setting up productions for relatively short period of time, but it's still a different time frame. It's a year and a half. And so we always are very actively involved. We're able to bring in trainees. I think one of the critical things there, though, if you want to put it on productions to do it, you've got to make it very simple and straightforward. Because we're not going to do it if it's complicated.
Well, it's like shadowing, isn't it? That's easy and straightforward. You know,
well, even that now isn't, if you want to interact. I mean, often, yeah, form filling, exactly. We will often now put trainees in and not bother trying to integrate, you know, access whatever's there, because we're too busy and we give up.
Yeah, I think every production I've won, we do have trainees, but it is that idea of, you know, the paperwork or whatever is done. That has to be, someone has to come and say, this is your trainee, this is what we're doing, we're paying them, for instance, because productions don't want to bear the cost of it often, because you don't need them in terms of making the production. And so that, because I think training is essential, and I think training on the job is essential, because, you know, what happened, I speak to quite a lot of students who come out and they've got their MA in film and TV, they've got whatever they've got and their stuff, and I go, well, that's great, you're going to be a runner. You're going to start exactly where you, because you need to get on the floor experience.
Just to observe something about that, we at the Creative Industries Advisory Group had a meeting yesterday, and we were talking to Mr. Hepburn, it's worth noting that exactly what the witnesses here are talking about is a cross-sectoral creative industries issue. The business pattern in other sectors of the creative industries or subsectors are very comparable. And the challenges to them accessing there's a clear willingness on the government's part to support training, but they face, if you're running a craft business, textiles business, they face exactly the same problems people here are talking about.
I think what has to be remembered is, in even major productions, from if I'm the producer on a show, from me down, everyone is freelance. Do you know what I mean? So it's a freelance business, so the training is different from a normal sector, because, you know, there'll be a few key people who'll be employed full-time by the company, maybe 3 or 4 people. The other 70, 80 people are all freelance. So training has to be looked at slightly different from other industries.
Are there any under the modern apprenticeship scheme, for example, we're in apprenticeship week, sort of an awareness-raising week, really, at the moment. Are there any modern apprenticeships in your line of work?
They're the ones that are really difficult, because, you know, part of that scheme is that you have to take them on for a year, and we work in a freelance business.
I'd love a trainee apprentice in my office, if there's any going.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. I mean, obviously, you know, that in the longer term, that we have to find some way forward for training, because if we don't train people, we don't have a sustainable industry. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning, panel. And you know, Annabelle, Page-Croft, you started very optimistically this morning by saying that there was progress in the sector, but I have to say I've heard a lot of deep frustration that's come out from the panel this morning in terms of your responses. To put the progress in context, I'm struggling to see it really in financial terms, because the figures we actually have said that the value of the production sector fell in 1919 from the previous year from £95 to £67 million, a drop of around 30%, although indigenous production was up 40% from 16.8 to 23.5 million, around 40%. But in terms of the UK industry, the same year was worth £3.6 billion. So Scotland is delivering less than 2% of that, which is alarmingly small. And obviously, do you believe that Screen Scotland's business plan to more than double last year's production spend to 138 million within 3 years is realistic? And if so, how can it be achieved?
Well, I would draw your attention to my earlier comment that I don't believe the baseline numbers are meaningful. They're not an accurate. So I don't. It's not possible to answer the question. because the baseline is just an arbitrary number. It fails to capture some things, it captures other things. I had the misfortune of having to look at it in some detail. So I think it's very, very problematic and needs to be revisited. Can that doubling or tripling? Doubling. It's possible because of this. We are, I think, in scrutinising Screen Scotland, it is important to recognise that we are in a moment of enormous global disruption of the industry. And so, it's very difficult for anyone, us as independent producers or them, to have a sort of clear linear platform. But I think it is possible because there are enormous amounts of money being spent by the platforms on high-end drama. And if we are able to get our share of that, then it's possible to achieve those numbers. I think what my colleagues have been very keen to emphasise is that the only way you can achieve those big numbers is by bringing that incoming money in, and it's very important that you do not just do that.
I think there's
That's the point.
sorry, what I've realised is in terms of the past 5 years or whatever, with all the video on demand, etc., the production spend has really gone up in terms of, so those shows, for instance, a conventional BBC show where you maybe get $1 million an hour to make drama, you go to Netflix, it's 3 or 4 million. So if you can get those kind of shows in, then you can really up your money.
But I would say, as a producer who goes to market a lot as well, if your national agency has your back and you have a really trusted relationship with your agency, and if you as the producer is bringing in a project and you kind of guarantee that you hope you can guarantee that the Screen Scotland money is going to be forthcoming, you can bring in co-productions, and that's a good way to sustain your business while often, sometimes you have to put your own projects into hiatus while you make a co-production. But that is how you increase the spend. I would just hasten to add, if you have producers, and sometimes this happens as well, and we're sending our producers to markets, and we like our producers being out in all of these international markets, but there has to be the trust. They need to know they can deliver the money when the applications come in. And, I guess I've been in situations a couple of times over the last 5 years where Screen Scotland, Creative Scotland haven't delivered the money for me. And then you are so weakened at the table, and you've spent months nurturing, negotiating, bringing people back to Scotland, and then you don't get the money. And you're like, and it's devastating, and you sit there and you've spent months and months doing this. So I think, yes, we can hit the spend, but Creative Scotland have to be able to have the producers who are either bringing in the projects, if it's co-productions, or bringing in Amazon, or bringing in Netflix. But that amount of money is very attractive to incoming productions.
I don't know how the mechanism is slightly off-screen. The mechanism with this would work, and it's obviously different because I think in the UK, the high-end tax break, of course, is UK-wide. Yeah. But when I'm going to shoot in other countries, to be able to access that tax break, I have to work with a local company. And that makes, because those companies are working primarily not as much as a co-producer, but more like a service company. But that income is their basis for developing their own projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if something like that was happening here, whereas if Screen Scotland were giving out money, but part of the provision of that was you had to work with a local company, that could change.
I mean, that is still not in place formally, and Creative Scotland have resisted it. I'm not quite sure what Screen Scotland's policy is on it, and obviously they are looking at their kind of guidelines at the moment. But, you go to Canada, you cannot get anywhere near the Canadian money without a gatekeeper producer who is the person who's going to guide you through the system. And they absolutely, it's all about enabling the producers, not the people. The gatekeepers are the producers, not the agency.
I've actually found all your submissions and comments this morning really, really fascinating, and I'd like to ask a load of questions, but obviously we're running short of time. So we've heard everything from the need for, studios of some description and specific geographic locations. I mean, Heart Health, for example, we've heard about the need for third-party support to try and open doors, etc. Could I just ask each of you what your 3 priorities would be to turn around, and some of them might be the same priorities, to turn around and grow this industry the way you would like to see it grow in Scotland over the next 5 years, say? Whoever would like to start.
Well, I would like to say something about that. you know, we've heard a lot today. We've heard a lot about, you know, the big studio and the big money coming in with that potentially, the big production. We've heard about long-run and returnable series. These are all mantras that have been talked about for years. But, you know, we need that, yes. But if all the energy is directed towards that, which, you know, again, you know, Screen Scotland are in between a bit of a rock and a hard place. If they're expected to increase production spend, yet do all these other things we're talking about. So I would like to see, I'm not saying no about the high growth strategies, but I would like to see more emphasis on co-production, enabling producers, you know, from the small ones to the big ones, to go into the marketplace, to bring in more co-production money. That's specifically what, and Indigenous companies will benefit from that. But it won't bring the huge spend. It'll bring sustainable spend for the production companies. And I'd also like to say again, Screen Scotland being in a bit of a rock and a hard place because they're expected to go out and consult and develop all these policies. I believe myself that Scotland needs a screen policy. That is made by the stakeholders of the industry, much in the same way that the stakeholders came together under the Screen Leadership Group. That I think that they could be the mechanism to create policy, which would be an industry strategy, an industry-based strategy, because the industry knows what it needs to develop. And that policy is made and instituted by the Scottish Government, and that the Screen Scotland become the agency that implements that policy. So in a way that they've got, and are accountable to deliver it. And in a way they've got then a straightforward role, that they're not being charged all the time to be everything to everybody and go out and consult with the industry all the time, when it's quite difficult for them to do that, because you've heard from the panel today that there's, you know, there's all sorts of different industry groups. And you know, who do they could be consulting every 5 minutes, as well as having their partnership meetings with all the different interagencies that they don't. So it's to get out of that talk shop and into, you know, this is a policy, can you find the best way to implement it based on data, driven by data, and driven by industry needs, articulated by the industry. That's what I'd like to see.
Only two right enough, Annabelle.
Sorry.
No, there's time left, and we've got the Secretary of State in quite sharp next. So
Just try to round it all up.
I know. I've got. I've there's probably 5 things, but I'll start with. I've got business company investment. I think that would really help, or a loan system. We haven't actually got a kind of, you know, a sort of soft loan system, which I think would be interesting. Market and broadcaster brokering. We've got market and broadcaster brokering is to help us access. You know, that's something I think that you know, I personally would really feel. And I think, you know, going back to, you know, the studio is always going to be something that everybody wants, but you know. Co-producer status, so you can't get to our funding without having a Scottish co-producer, for me is a golden ticket, and I think I'd probably speak for all producers in Scotland. Oh, I've got another one on data. Let's drill down on the data.
Okay.
Thank you.
that was something that they said they were going to do as well.
Great.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Sorry, Bob.
Yes, if I really had good answers, I'd be working there. I think for me, partnerships need leadership. They need to be led, and a strong leader is best placed to create effective partnership working, and I would like to see that clearly embedded in the ongoing governance of the Screen Scotland, and I believe that's important and get in terms of its ability to deliver across all of the things that have been talked about. I think they are working on articulating you know, their different interventions clearly, because we have to, as people have talked here, the clarity around inward investment and its role, Indigenous company development, all of these things are different strands, and the more clearly their interventions are articulated to each of these goals, the better. It's not a one-stop shop, to quote that phrase. But I think the third thing I would put is that we as a sector also have to be realistic. The screens, we're a small country and there's a lot of shouting about Screen Scotland. as there was about Scottish Screen and so on and so forth. And if we want them to operate effectively, we also have to shut up a little bit, because they cannot do everything for all of us. We all, and myself included, love it when they give us money, and then they seem very failing and poor agency when they don't. Of course, that's only human. No,
But we're all saying we have made a massive step in the right direction.
we are all saying that, but in general, there is sometimes a lack of realism about the limit. They can't do everything.
No.
And I think we've sometimes, across all of these different organisations, we end up asking them to do everything, and that actually makes their job more difficult.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'll be brief. Annabelle covered pretty much everything. But I'd say the only thing is we do need support because it's an international marketplace out there now. And, you know, the joke is, you know, it's a £250 cup of coffee even to go to London for a meeting. You know, and being on the periphery, you know, and we are in the periphery of the business, whether it's London or whether it's LA or whatever, and we have to recognise that does need some extra support, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much. That seems to be a good way to wind up. Thanks very much to all of you for coming in to see us today. It's been really, really helpful, and it's given us lots to think about and to put to Screen Scotland when we have them in. Thank you very much. And we'll suspend briefly.